We live in a world where there is more access to information than ever before. Generations, young and old, are being exposed to radically different ideologies and opinions every day. It can be so overwhelming trying to decipher what's true and what's false. But there is a way. Join me as we discuss some of the toughest questions out there about Christianity, the Bible, and culture. I'm your host, Nick Lackey. Welcome to the Garrison. All right, well, welcome everybody to another Garrison podcast. It's great to have everyone listening here today. It's very exciting because this is our second interview and we have Lew Meyer with us today. And I first got introduced to Lew when I read his book, which at the time was called Evolution vs. Factor X, but he has updated it to a book called What Killed Evolution, which I read previously or earlier this week. And today I'm going to be interviewing Lew on his book that he wrote and some of the points he makes. But before we get into that, Lew, would you like to introduce yourself and tell everyone who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that. It's good to be with you, Nick. I'm my background in educationally is I was brought up in a small town, New Zealand, and I wanted to be a doctor. Didn't get into med school, but I carried on and I finished a degree in biochemistry at Massey University in Palmerston North. Biochemistry fascinated me because it was just so phenomenally complex, and it all fits together like a massive interlocking system.
Yeah.
And so I finished that, and I worked in a research lab on the campus in organic chemistry, biochemistry for a couple of years. But the other part of my passion is that I'm a Christian communicator.
Mm-hmm.
So then I moved to Auckland and did some theological training. And since that time, I've worked as a youth worker, speaking to kids, ones, twos, hundreds, at
Mm-hmm.
conferences and camps. And I speak at a lot of camps. I lecture at Bible schools.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so next week I'll be heading off down to Cape and Ray Bible School and to lecture on apologetics and cults and religions. Um, so I've worked as a youth pastor. I've worked for about 34 years as a communicator with an organisation called OAC Ministries.
Mm-hmm.
And we train communicators, and as you know, I'm a writer. So, and I'm also a church elder. So I've got a bit of a. We also train community chaplains around the country. So I've got a lot of irons and a lot of fires.
Hmm. Oh, cool. Well, thanks, Lew. I appreciate that. Before I start asking you questions on the book, do you want to tell everyone why you updated your original book? Because I read your original book, which was Evolution versus Factor X, which I thought was brilliant. But then you've gone and updated it into What Killed Evolution. So, what was the reason for the updated version?
And there's a number of reasons, and one of them is because I've been improving the design and the style and the look of them. Secondly, because scientific research moves on,
Hmm.
and when you're dealing with scientific matters, you need to make sure that your information is as up to date as reasonably possible. And so those are the main reasons.
Hmm.
We're a bit more serious about publishing now, and my wife is my editor, and she's a very tough editor, which is good, but it's a pain. And and she's insisting on a quality beyond what I've had in the past. So a number of reasons, including my
Yeah,
wife.
yeah. Oh, good, good. Awesome. Well, with that being said, I'd love to jump into the book. And it's a short book, but it's very effective. And I think it's great because often I find myself not wanting to maybe dive into, a 500-page, really deep book. But it's good to just have a wee kind of bite-sized thing that I can read in. I mean, if someone wanted to, they could read this in a day, but I read it over a few days to try and take it all in. But I guess the premise of the book is that you have three bullets, or bullets which go to kill evolution, and each bullet is a bit of evidence or an argument against evolution or an argument for creationism or intelligent design. So this first bullet is a topic which we've covered on the Garrison already, talking about the cosmological argument or arguing that something has to come from something, it cannot come from nothing. And I think that's a brilliant point you make, but we're not going to get into that one today. Instead, we're going to jump into bullet two, which is talking about how mathematics goes to show that it's very unlikely that a cell could have evolved itself. So, Lou, do you want to talk a wee bit about the proteins and the subunits and how mathematically it's very, very unlikely to the point where I believe you say basically impossible that cells could have just formed themselves or made themselves up.
Yeah, good night. So in the book, I really deal with the three phases, just like evolution. The first bit that we're not going to deal with
Hmm.
in depth is what we call cosmic evolution. How did the cosmos come,
Yeah.
and why is there something and not nothing? And that also links to philosophy, obviously. But then my interest is in because evolution really is a biological concept. And so is the two phases. One is how do we get to pure organic molecules to a living system as fabulously complex as a living cell. So
Mm.
that's phase two in the book, and that's a critical phase because if you can't get to a first living cell, then you can't evolve anything because
Yeah.
you need a mutating replicator um, to be able to evolve if evolution was in fact um, biologically possible. And so I make a point in the book of going back to my area of research, which was protein chemistry, and and so I because I worked in a laboratory with a team that were synthesizing proteins,
Yeah.
and there were other teams nearby that were trying to figure out which amino acids went where in these proteins, and we do that a lot better now with much better machinery. But it really struck me. It really struck me that even at uni, sitting there listening to my biochemistry lecturers, I remember we had this rather cynical classic a lecturer called Dr. Midwinter in biochemistry. And I remember him coming to describe in the cell a process in the cellular chemistry and stopping and saying, something like, if there was anything that caused me to believe in God, it would be this.
Yeah.
Because he's describing one of those systems that needs to be absolutely complete, else it'll just mutate away. So you can't develop it from something more simple. And there are thousands of systems like that. It's called the principle of irreducible complexity,
Yeah.
and it's a very powerful argument for design, a mind behind the universe. But so my area was really proteins and protein chemistry, and it just really struck me. And it's very simple. A protein is a series of subunits, and you've got to put those subunits together in the right order.
Yeah.
And a very small protein is like 200 in the right order. And when you look at the chances of getting two together in the right ones,
Hmm.
you've got you've got no you've got it's easy. You got 20 and you're getting two of the right ones in the order. That's 1 in 20 times 1 in 20, which is 1 in 400.
Yeah.
And you get three, well, that's 1 in 160, I think.
Hmm.
My maths wasn't the greatest subject to me, but and, and then you've got, but by the time you get to like 80, um, which is not yet a protein,
Hmm.
and you're just into nonsense stuff as far astronomical numbers as far as possibility is concerned.
Yeah, and I'll just read out from the book very quickly. I've got it in front of me.
Okay.
You say the chance of getting 62 correct subunits added is 1 in 10, followed by 80 zeros, which I mean, I don't even know if there's a name for that number. As you say, it's just astronomically enormous how small
Well,
the
that number,
chances.
yeah, that number, Nick, is the estimate we have of how many atoms there are in the whole universe.
Wow.
And so then I use the illustration: if there's an atom with your name on it, and you
Mm.
dive into a spaceship and go to some other galaxy, and you say, "I'll go to that solar system over there," and then you zoom down, "I'll go to that planet there," and I'll go to that hill there, and I'll go to that piece of dust there, and I'll pick
Yeah.
that piece of dust. what are the chances of you getting the one atom in the whole universe with your name on it
Mm.
first go?
Yeah.
And the answer is 1 in 10 to the 80. And so, and the point is that we're not even looking at a whole protein. We're looking at a very short, what we call a polypeptide, a protein that's could be functional in certain situations, but it's not particularly big.
Yeah.
But even if that was possible, and some atheistic people say, yeah, okay, it's highly improbable, but it's technically possible. So,
Yeah.
no, even if that's possible, all you've got is one protein molecule, and that will break down. We had to freeze this stuff, and
Yeah.
it was nowhere near as big as 100 as 80 subunits. We had to freeze it, or it would just be gone in the morning. It
Mm.
hydrolyzes it, and so all you've got is one protein. You've got to have zillions of copies of exactly the same protein, and zillions of copies of multiple thousands of other complex molecules. They've got to be in the same place in the universe at the same moment of time, and, and they have to be inside a cell, and and or you've got nothing,
Mm.
because it can't survive. And
So would you
so, sorry.
would you say that the belief in uh, that Darwinian evolution or the belief in atheism would require faith?
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. They're both faith. They're really both faith positions.
Mm.
I just prefer faith with evidence.
Yeah.
And you can't. I mean, you can't. You can never argue from philosophy that effectively that there's no God, because you can't go everywhere and look.
Mm.
You can't. We can't argue a universal negative. Um,
Yeah.
but so I would say it is a faith position, but it's really faith that something can operate against overwhelmingly tiny possibilities. And we don't deal that way in science. We don't deal that way in knowledge. It's
Yeah.
like inventing a whole new reality to get yourself out of believing in God.
Yeah.
but but science doesn't work that way, and generally people don't work that way. I don't think there are that many true atheists, Nick,
Yeah.
and certainly not in the biochemistry world.
Mm.
You can maybe get away with it in the biology world, where you look at two creatures and they say, yeah, yeah, they've both got similar arm bones, and so you think, well, they can maybe they came from similar ancestors, and you can make assertions about that. But when you look at the biochemistry that's required, it's just out of the ballpark.
Mm.
Not only out of the ballpark, it's out of the galaxy. You
Yeah.
know. Now, until you've got a living cell, of course, so you've got organic evolution, where you get to the idea that you can get to a first living cell, and that can multiply, and then that diversifies, and you get all. The second phase is, how do you get from a first reproducing living cell in a reproducing environment to you and I and
Yeah.
all of the life systems? And
Cool.
that's
And
really evolution. That's biological evolution.
mm.
And of course, before Darwin's time, they they had very little idea of genetics, very little idea of microbiology and biochemistry. They thought cells were fairly simple gelatinous blobs. They just didn't get it. And so then when we developed more knowledge in biochemistry, then scientists had to change their theory, and so they came up with what's called the neo-Darwinian interpretation of evolution.
Yeah.
So that had to explain how we can get from, like, a very basic living cell with 1,000 pages of information on the DNA,
Mhm.
to you and I with like 1,000,000 pages of information on our DNA. How
Yeah.
do you get a thousand-fold increase, and not reproduced information, but novel information, new information? How do you get that? And the answer, because the evolutionary principles are little changes, mutations, develop to become big changes, and given enough time, you're you've got then you can explain all of the different life forms on Earth.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
the reality is that little changes don't make big changes.
Mhm. Can I
There's
ask a
no
quick question?
there can't be any target either, um, because if there's no intelligence behind this, how do you know what you want to end up at?
Yeah,
How do you
yeah.
know what's next? Yeah. So carry on.
Mhm. I was just going to ask about, what's the difference between what's called microevolution and macroevolution? And you talk a wee bit about this in your book about how random mutation in our DNA cannot produce any new information, but rather has to just work with what it's already got. Do you want to talk about that a wee bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is an important distinction. I don't like to use the word evolution because it conveys a wrong idea.
Mm,
But a lot of scientists and philosophers and that um, they talk about microevolution and they talk about macroevolution. And microevolution is really what they mean there is really natural selection.
yeah,
Okay, so for example, and I use in my book the example of the swamp and the mosquitoes
yeah,
and how somebody sprays up the DNA and so not DNA, DDT, insecticide, and there's a male and a female mozzie in there that happens to have a mutation that blocks the influence of DDT. So they survive, they produce a whole new information. Okay, so scientists kind of wildly extrapolate that concept to say, well, so we can get change, okay, and therefore, if you extrapolate it, we can get change from a first living cell to a professor at the university. Now, the reality is we do get change, but that change does not increase information. That change actually removes information.
right.
It makes the creature genetically poorer. And you see this, as I mentioned in the book, in dog species that have been highly bred. So that's actually artificial selection, but
Yeah,
um, it's the same effect. But what does it do? Ultimately it destroys the species because it makes them more vulnerable. They're not as genetically rich. They don't have as much potential variation in their genes, so their survival factor goes down, and you end up with devolution,
yeah,
rather than evolution. So it is actually causing problems, and we see that in the human race, which is a horrifying point that's recently been made by scientists that we are mutating at a terrible rate. The
mm,
human future of the human race does not look great from a biochemical, genetic point of view.
yeah,
So, and macroevolution is like saying that okay, given enough time, these little changes make the macro changes, the
yeah,
big change, and you can end up with a creature having arms and legs, and yet another one having a tail and swimming in the ocean.
yeah, yeah,
Um, so they extrapolate microevolution to explain macroevolution, but you should not do that because microevolution impoverishes a species genetically. You need to enrich a species genetically to get anything new, anything novel,
yeah,
anything
yeah.
that hasn't. And you need massive amounts of information in one generation,
Mhm.
and it needs to be all complete. And one of the classic examples from nature of this, and there are millions and millions of them, is the monarch butterfly. We're all probably, most of us in New Zealand anyway, familiar with the monarch butterfly.
Mhm.
But think about the monarch butterfly that, okay, that egg is laid by the butterfly. That egg hatches into a pupal form, the caterpillar munches, munches, munches. Then it spins a little web, gets some prolegs, it hangs itself in the chrysalis, and then it basically turns to soup, and then it turns to butterfly,
Yeah.
and then and then it pumps up its wings, so it switches on its little pumps. And you look at that system and you realize that the amount of genetic control, switching on, switching off at just the right time, the sophistication of that system, the massive amounts of information on the DNA to make it work,
Mm.
and it has to be all work perfectly or no butterfly.
Yeah.
And this is why nature kind of communicates something to people that they don't always want to receive.
Yeah.
There is intelligence behind this system when you really understand it.
And I'd say like this point here when you're talking about irreducible complexity and um as you just mentioned about the butterfly again, when I talk to people about this, I can see that it takes so much more faith to believe that it all just came from nothing or happened randomly rather than there being an intelligent designer behind it all. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
I think
I think it's incredible.
I think, I mean, faith obviously got to be defined by as a reliance on something, and for example, in my life, faith in God is obviously my faith. So it needs to be an object to the faith. So you ask, well, what is the object of the faith of an atheist? And it's really faith in a system of laws of science that doesn't exist
Yeah.
because they've got to move outside of them and reverse them and overrule them. So they're actually having faith in an illusion,
Mm,
in an illusionary understanding of science. We've got, we understand the laws of science pretty well now, and
mm.
they cannot explain life on Earth. The other interesting factor, and I don't know if you want to go here, but and you're the boss, but and I know that a lot of people we've been so entrenched in what we call deep time in our understanding of the universe. Like, how many people would ever question that the universe is billions of years old?
Yeah.
But a lot of people don't realize that there are a whole lot of scientists who tend to be God believers, not all, probably not all of them, but most of them, who seriously question whether the concepts of deep time and certainly the radiometric dating and things like that, and
Yeah.
do allow for a universe that is actually ancient enough for evolution to happen, if it could happen. Now, to give you an example, and I'll just leave it here with this, but I was reading a recent book the other day about deep time, and there's over 100 reasons, according to a scientist, a friend of mine, that do not allow the universe to be billions of years old,
Yeah.
and certainly the surface of the Earth. And one of them is that they've found carbon 14 in diamonds. Now, diamonds are one of the hardest substances on Earth, and they are one of the least porous substance. Nothing basically can wash in and out of a diamond.
Yeah.
You know, uranium salts can wash in and out of rock, which actually puts a whole system as sus.
Mhm.
Potassium argon dating. Well, argon can reabsorb into rock, so it can muck up your system, and but nothing really washes in and out of diamonds, and we can only detect uh, uh, up to a theoretical 100,000 years maximum with carbon 14 dating.
Yeah.
And so the fact that there is carbon 14 found in diamonds means that the surface of the Earth cannot be more than 100,000 years old.
Mm.
Now, that's just one, and I think it's interesting, that people will argue with some of these different um, clock factors we have in nature. Most of them do not allow the universe to be billions of years old. They don't allow the deep time that evolution want to have, because they say, yeah, but they want to be able to say, yeah, but given enough time, anything can happen. So, or almost anything. And yet, there are all of these factors which come to bear on this argument as well. And so it's a fascinating and interesting area. But of course, ridicule is the great weapon of the atheist, and they would ridicule young Earth scientists
Yeah.
as being, you know, um, totally nutty, unhinged. But it's not the case at all. I mean, we're talking about real scientific investigations, and the more and more information comes out from science, the less likely these evolutionary things are able to happen.
Mhm. No, that's awesome. And I've been talking to people before, and often, talking to atheists, and they'll say something like, "Oh, well, science says that this isn't possible, or science says that that's possible." But science can't actually speak for itself. Yeah, it's the scientists who say, and often mainstream media will cover the general narrative, which will be, in the West, atheism and being pro macroevolution, Darwinian evolution, this kind of thing. But end of the day, as I'm sure you're aware, it's the scientists who have the voice, not science itself. And so, yeah, that's really uh, interesting what you say about these many scientists who are actually, questioning the deep time and the old Earth. But
Yeah,
mm,
yeah, and of course they don't get to publish in the mainstream publications because
yeah,
there's a belief system, there's a war of belief systems behind this. And the belief systems behind secularism and atheism and all of the stuff that goes on there is controlling the secular media. And most people just look at the secular media. So, you know, the odds are stacked against being able to have a broader understanding of the possibilities.
yeah. Yeah, I was going to ask for an another question because I think we've covered, bullet two in your book, and then a wee bit of bullet three. But I want to talk quickly about the fossil record because you talk about it in your book, and many people will point to this fossil record as evidence or proof of macroevolution. And so it would be awesome if you could talk about the like Nebraska Man and Lucy and all these fossils which people tend to point to prove evolution. So I guess the question is there a fossil record which proves evolution? And are these supposed, Nebraska Man and Lucy and these other names that they've given these fossils, are they reliable?
Mm. Good question, Nick. And I think we need to go back a wee bit and look at the history of the fossil record. Um, and Charles Darwin himself recognized that the fossil record in the rocks is one of his most serious problems of his theory. The fossil record was partly an ideological tool. Okay, remember, if you want to go back a couple of hundred years in the UK, and you've got Charles Lyell, and you've got Darwin, of course, and these guys were not scientists in the sense that he was not a geologist really. I think he was a lawyer, Lyell, but I'm not sure. And but he wrote Principles of Geology, and he had an ideological goal to separate science from the Bible.
Yeah.
Okay, so there was an ideological goal there. So he was going to be working to that end. And so they produced a philosophy called uniformitarianism. And basically it says this: you want to know what's going on in the past, on the history of the world, look at what's happening now.
Yeah.
So it's been uniform, change has only ever been gradual. Okay. So out of that, they developed what's called the geological column. And you see variations of this in most textbooks, and it's almost preached as an established fact. And you've got marine creatures and little babies and things, and then you've got the massive Precambrian explosion where a whole lot of things appear complete and in
Yeah.
working order, and then you've got a bit of other stuff, and you've got very little um, um, evidence of buried humans, and which I think significant actually, and that's one of the big uh, questions or issues that some creation scientists have. Where is the evidence of human history?
Hmm.
So basically, this was interpreted as this is a history of life on Earth, and so they were moving away from catastrophism, the idea that there's been some kind of worldwide flood or cataclysmic event,
Yeah.
to a gradualism. But a whole lot of stuff has come out. If the problem is we don't see any transition fossils. We don't see anything that's something between one kind of creature and another. And that was Darwin's big problem. But he thought, well, I guess we'll find them in the future. But we haven't. The problem's still the same. The other thing is that when you get these in the genuine fossil record, which, by the way, the idealized one you see in books is only, as far as I know, it's not found in that order anywhere in the world. So it's just an idea, really. But but in the genuine fossil record, you've got stuff laid down in layers, but there are no erosion zones. And this is a major problem because if you are going to lay down gradually, you have a flood, and then 27 years later you have another flood, and some more
Yeah.
creatures dying, get buried in there. Well, you're going to see wormholes, you're going to see erosion,
Yeah.
but what you actually see is like what you get if you get a tall glass jar and you put mud and mix it up,
Yeah.
and it will naturally layer according to density of particles and size of particles and things like that, weight. And you put some animals in there, you'll get your fossils, because sedimentary rock is basically a natural form of concrete
Yeah.
and slower setting. And so what the fossil record actually says is these creatures have been buried complete. These layers are not, you know, not time related. They're actually just density related and size related. And so, and that's what we see in the real world of science. So the fossil record has always been a problem for evolutionists. They still hark back to it. And what they tend to do is if they find a rock that's got a particular fossil in it, maybe a dinosaur tooth, well, then they will, if they are going to radioactively date it, carbon-14 is no good for that because it can only take us through thousands of years.
Hmm.
But they will choose the results that fit with the geological record. And so everything's kind of judged in its age by where it fits in the geological record. But at the same time, the geological record is not a history of life on Earth, it's a history of death on Earth.
Yeah.
And so this continues to be a major problem. But people just blithely go along accepting the traditional viewpoint, which is ideologically pushed, that this is actually a history of life on Earth. So, but when it comes to supposed pre-human creatures, now we need to clarify. A lot of people say, "Oh, we came from monkeys." Now, evolutionists don't believe that we came from monkeys. They believe that monkeys and us had a common ancestor.
Yeah.
Okay, so the missing link, and so I'd argue the missing chain. Okay, um, but what you've got, of course, you've got a whole evolutionary community that's desperately to fill that gap in the fossil record and explain how in the last 5 million years humans became humans. And so they are needing to find some evidence. And so when they dig around, in a lake bed in Africa and they find a few bones here and a few bones here, it is an acknowledged fact by honest scientists that there's a massive temptation to read more into that information than you actually see.
Hmm.
And this is where Nebraska Man and these other ones, and even Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis by, and the Leakeys and their various skulls and skeletons and things like this. You can read way too much into that. And I mentioned in the book how Australopithecus ramidus, I actually read it in the New Zealand Herald newspaper. Wow, that's pretty convincing evidence. Better look that up. And for this creature, our supposed pre-human ancestor, that there was like some knee joint bones and some
Yeah.
teeth somewhere else. I think it was about 500 meters. And this is assumed to be the same creature.
Mm.
And it's just, as I point out, in any other area of science, it would be laughable. It would be nonsense. But because there's such a powerful drive of the ideology to find evidence, it is just kind of accepted. So they take a different view of science when they're desperate for evidence, and this is what we see, and in the many different supposed fossils. There's not that much fossil evidence for humans at all, actually,
Yeah.
and I would argue that it's not evidence. The other thing is, you have a look around the world. And you look at the huge variation there are in skull shapes in living human beings. Now, from DNA, we're pretty sure now that we're all cousins.
Yeah.
And you've got some people have got flat noses. I know a lovely person in our church who looks like they ran into a fairly solid brick wall, and their facial structure is entirely different to mine.
Yeah.
And so if you're desperate for evidence, and we dug her up and, in a couple of 100 years, she might be dated at, wow, look at this. She might be dated at um, for 2 or 3 million years old, coming out of Asia,
Yeah.
or Africa or something. And so a whole lot of it is about artistic license, speculation, and lack of evidence. Well, when we get a dinosaur whole skeleton
Yep.
together,
Mhm.
as we do, by the way, soft tissue in dinosaurs being found now, and blood cells in dinosaur bones, which proves that they haven't been extinct for 60 million years, like the evolutionary model says.
Yeah.
That's just blown that whole area of science out of the water, but they're desperately holding on to it for some reason. Well, then you've got a whole skeleton, you've got something to talk about, and maybe some fossilized eggs, some dung, and stuff like that. But a few bones here and there, and a bit of a jawbone. And of course, there have been hoaxes, and Nebraska man was a pig's tooth in the end. So the artistic license came in. They had this ape human looking guy and his ape human looking partner there, and she's cooking
Mhm.
the dinner. He's and they and they made it all out of the tooth of an extinct form of pig.
Yeah.
And scientists who do this nonsense should be ashamed of themselves because it's an insult to science.
Yep.
I love science and I hate it when it's abused. You know?
Mm.
But yeah, so that's the history, and there are books about that people can get hold of, contentious bones and things like this. Creation.org's got books where people can look at the true evidence behind some of these apparent finds. The
Yeah.
bottom line is we don't know a hang of a lot much about the human race, except that there's 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 not the there's not the evidence there of big enough populations to explain it from a non-biblical perspective.
Yeah, cool. So the last question I had for you, Lou, was in spite of, all the evidence that we have for an intelligent designer or something or some god or being to create the universe, in spite of all of this evidence and the lack of evidence that atheists have for evolution or Darwinian evolution, secularism, whatever you want to call it, why do you think people still hold on to these beliefs? I mean, scientifically, if we're looking at the evidence, it doesn't really make sense to believe in this. So, in spite of all of this, why do people still hold on to these views? Do you think there's something else going on behind it? And if so, what is it?
Good question. I think there are a lot of people keep holding on to these beliefs because they are gullible. They don't have the scientific nous to really assess the information that's coming from their teachers and the university professors. A lot of a lot of the teachers, like high school science teachers, they are they gen. I think a lot of people actually have questions deep down, but professionally they can't be shown to to be having those questions. So they kind of live in two worlds. They have a dichotomy in their thinking. As I said, most scientists I don't think are really atheists. So some are agnostic, and some of course have genuine belief in God. But I think the other thing is that there's something in human nature, and that from a biblical perspective, teaches us that human nature is actually warped, and part of us, it's like we want to be our own God. It's like
Yeah.
self deification, and we want to determine our own reality, and we actually want to um, find our own meaning in life. We think we're better at it than what's been shown to us and what seemed clearly to be God revealing it to us. And we don't want to be accountable for our behavior. Basically,
Mm.
if I want to be sleeping with my neighbor's wife, I don't want to. I don't want to actually one day have an interview with the biblical God,
Yeah.
the God of Christianity. So I'll either twist my concept of God, or I'll try to convince myself that there is no God so I can relax. And if I can get away with it, good on me. There's no ultimate
Yeah.
moral code. So I want to make my own moral code. I want to make my own reality, and I want to have life on my terms. So I want to be my own God, and I don't want the competition from the true God. And so I think a lot of people live in this kind of like la la land, and they don't even realize why they're actually reacting against what science is saying and has always really been saying, if it was properly understood, that there was design behind the universe. So people, every design is accountable to its designer. If I make something and it's just rubbish, well, then I check it out. Or if I make something and it doesn't function. And so if we have been designed by the biblical God, the God of the Bible, well, then we're obviously accountable to that God. And people don't want that accountability. I think that is at the root of where a lot of people are at. But with a lot of people, it's just gullibility and ignorance. And
Yeah.
therefore, it's the scientists who are actually distorting the facts that have the greatest sin, if I can use that
Yeah.
word.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think I completely agree with you there, and I mean, as you say, from a biblical perspective, obviously the Bible agrees as well. I'll just read quickly from uh, Romans chapter 1, where it talks about it says, "Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." And often people will ask, why doesn't God just appear to us, or why doesn't He just show Himself to us and make it so obvious? But one of my replies to that is, I mean, God has given us creation as a testimony. I mean, creation, as we've talked about a wee bit today, is just proof in itself of God, because we know that just as a building can't exist without a builder, creation can't exist without a creator. And it goes on to say, again in Romans chapter 1, professing to be professing to be wise, they became fools. And I think that this is so relevant for a lot of the uh, so-called scientific community, and many people who teach the theory of evolution as fact, is they are held to be very wise and very knowledgeable, but end of the day, it's a foolish belief what they they truly believe. So yeah, I think you've
Absolutely.
summed that up well.
You see this for
In most of
Richard
it.
Dawkins, for example,
Yeah.
it's like their brain ceased to function in a way because, now they're saying, okay, okay, it's difficult here, but life must have come from outer space. And it's kind
Yeah.
of like that actually explains it. Like that just takes the problem somewhere else, it doesn't
Yeah.
take away the problem. How can you think like that? And it says their thinking became futile, their foolish hearts were darkened. And there is that moral thing in our nature that is operating here. And I think that can I speak as an evangelist? Because that's what I am. I'm a communicator of the Christian faith. That people operate at two levels. They chop themselves in half cognitively, in a sense, and never assume that somebody who says they're an atheist really is,
Mm.
because there's a whole area of their being, and people explain this sometimes like um, there were no atheists in the trenches. I've got a colleague in the Ukraine, and he's been working as a, a chaplain in the army during the problems, and they've been going on for years. And these hardened atheists that came out of the Soviet regimes, when the shells start exploding around them, they say, "Padre, pray for us." And a lot of people don't realize that there is an inner knowledge they have. They've been trying to deny it,
Yeah.
trying to suppress it, but it keeps
Hmm.
popping up. So when it pops up, let's remind them where it comes from.
Yeah. No, that's great. Well, thank you very much, Lou, for all that you gave us today to think about and to learn. I greatly benefited from both of your books, both the older version and the newer version. So, if you're
Can
listening and you want to look into more of what Lou has written, Lou, do you want to tell us quickly about where people can find more of your books
Yeah,
and
sure, Nick.
yeah,
So just I've done so like the first stage is what killed evolution, and then if people realise actually the evidence is good, there is a designer. The next one is called uh, which faith is true,
yeah,
because not all faiths can be true. If Hinduism is true, my beliefs are wrong,
yeah,
and so which faith is true, and then I've written another one called Are You Right with God? And then but I've also done a series of 8 on cults. So I've done great news for Jehovah's Witnesses, great news for Mormons, great news for Roman Catholics, great news for Seventh Day Adventists, great news for Hindus, for Buddhists, for Sikhs, and for Muslims. And they're all available. They're little $5 books,
yeah, yeah.
knock them out in an hour. They're available at LifeQuest Resources, one word, lifequestresources.org.
Hmm.
Oh, .nz. Nick, have a look on the back of your book. It should have the correct email address, the correct website. But it's LifeQuest Resources, and I think it's .co.nz, but I'm not 100% sure. Isn't that awful?
Oh well, I'm sure if you search up
LifeQuest Resources New Zealand,
you'll
you'll
find
find it. Yeah.
Perfect.
So you look there and you can order. Lovely. Talk to you.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Lew, and thank you everyone for listening. We will see you on the next episode of The Garrison.